The Indian market is defined by its sheer economic momentum. It is a vast, continuous engine of industrial output, scaling rapidly and stamping out wealth at an accelerating rate. In 2014, the Indian government attempted to capture a fraction of that momentum for social development. They enacted a policy making India the first nation in the world to legally mandate corporate social responsibility, or CSR. The law targets only the largest economic engines. If a company hits any of three financial triggers, a net worth of 500 crore rupees, a turnover of 1,000 crore, or a net profit of 5 crore, they are legally bound to participate. The core requirement of this law is absolute. Eligible companies must surrender exactly 2% of their average net profits to fund social development activities. On paper, this reads as a highly efficient wealth redistribution mechanism, a direct pipeline routing excess corporate capital into solving the country's deepest socio-economic deficits. But injecting vast amounts of capital into a system by force creates friction. By mandating this spending, the policy has increased structural financial risk for the participating firms, while causing severe geographic malinvestment of the funds themselves. Over the first 6 years following the mandate, corporate compliance and total expenditure steadily scaled upward. Firms adapted their accounting and mobilized the required capital. This chart shows total prescribed and actual spend on CSR over those first 6 years. Looking specifically at fiscal year 1920, right before the pandemic, we see actual expenditure hitting a peak of 21,231 crore rupees. The law successfully forced capital out. Yet at the microeconomic level, this creates an unexpected consequence. Forcing companies to engage in philanthropy actually increases their systematic risk, specifically their beta. And at the macroeconomic level, a second failure emerges. The billions of rupees extracted for social development struggle to reach the nation's most impoverished populations, largely bypassing the areas of greatest need. To understand why this capital fails its intended purpose, we have to examine the legal friction that alters corporate psychology at the board level. The mandate is governed by Section 135(1) of the Companies Act 2013. Originally, the law stated that CSR provisions applied to companies hitting those financial thresholds during any of the 3 preceding financial years. In 2017, the Companies Amendment Act modernized this rule. It shifted the applicability trigger so that companies were only evaluated based on their performance in the immediately preceding financial year. But the legislative framework contains a critical contradiction. CSR Rule 3.2, the regulation defining when a company can stop its CSR obligations, was never updated. It leaves an obsolete 3-year timeline on the books, contradicting the 2017 amendment. A second layer of confusion exists in Rule 3.1. The text poorly defines whether the holding companies or subsidiaries of an eligible firm are also forced to comply with the mandate, creating widespread ambiguity over who actually owes the 2%. For corporate general counsel and boards of directors, these redundancies and vague definitions represent severe legal liability. Their priority shifts from executing effective social programs to protecting the firm from regulatory penalties. This sloppy legal framework dictates the entire corporate response. Motivation moves away from strategic philanthropy and settles into a strict defensive posture. This defensive posture has acute financial consequences. Traditional economics suggests that when a firm voluntarily engages in social responsibility, it lowers systematic risk because the spending acts as a powerful brand differentiator. This diagram shows why. Firm A utilizes voluntary CSR, generating loyalty. This creates an inelastic demand curve, where customers gladly pay a premium. Firm B, doing no CSR, is stuck with a flat, highly elastic curve, competing purely on price. When the government introduces a mandatory regime, every single competitor is forced to match that identical CSR spending. The curves normalize. Firm A's inelasticity advantage is stripped away. Without that market differentiation, the 2% expenditure ceases to be an investment in the brand. Instead, it behaves mathematically as a backdoor corporate tax. But unlike standard taxes that scale up and down with overall profitability, mandatory CSR commitments often lock companies into multi-year project funding. This transforms the expenditure into a fixed operational cost. Adding a mandatory fixed cost to the balance sheet increases a firm's operating leverage. Higher operating leverage means earnings become significantly more sensitive to fluctuations in sales. Because the brand differentiator is eliminated and fixed operational costs increase, the legal mandate forces the firm to absorb greater systematic risk, entirely at the expense of its shareholders. We can map exactly how this defensive, risk-averse corporate behavior impacts the physical geography of India. When highly leveraged corporations are forced to deploy capital, they look for safety. This map of India visualizes the geographic distribution of the 92,793 crore rupees spent over the first 6 years of the mandate. Notice where the spending clusters. The capital pools heavily in regions that are already highly industrialized. These specific states, alongside a handful of other developed regions, absorbed an overwhelming 44.5% of all national CSR funds. Now look at the lightest blue states in the north and east, places like Bihar, Jharkhand, and Uttar Pradesh. These are the regions suffering the nation's most severe socioeconomic and infrastructure deficits. Combined, these high-need states received roughly 5.7% of the total expenditure, a staggering contrast to the capital flowing into industrialized hubs. When firms optimize for legal safety, they deploy capital directly next to their own headquarters and factories. A national development mandate effectively devolves into localized corporate landscaping. This risk-averse behavior dictates not just where the money goes, but exactly what causes it is allowed to fund. This table breaks down the spending by sector. There is an absolute dominance of traditional, easily verifiable philanthropic efforts. Education takes over 30%, and healthcare captures 18%. Funding a physical school or a clinic provides a corporation with highly visible, easily auditable proof of compliance. It satisfies the regulators with minimal complication. Compare that to the funding allocated to highly complex, socially challenging issues. Gender equality receives just 0.37% of the capital, and agroforestry secures a mere 0.27%. Corporations avoid these vital sectors because solving them lacks proven short-term impact metrics. There is no easy audit trail, and the NGO networks required to execute the work are not mature enough to guarantee legal safety for the firm. The mandate starves innovative social initiatives of patient capital. The funds are trapped in conventional projects that offer the path of least regulatory resistance. To prove that compliance and safety are the overriding corporate motivations, we can look at foreign multinational corporations. Japanese firms operating in India serve as the ultimate test case for navigating this exogenous regulation. Surveying these multinational firms reveals their true internal hierarchy of motivations when deciding how to allocate their mandated social spending. This bar chart measures what drives their CSR objectives. Compliance with Section 135 outranks almost all other business strategies, sitting at 91%. The only objective higher is contribution to local communities. But in a corporate risk context, contributing to the local community simply means securing a social license to operate strictly within the immediate radius of their own supply chains and factories. These corporations are not behaving maliciously. They are logically optimizing their operations to survive ambiguous laws in an emerging market. The 2014 mandate created an inescapable feedback loop. A statutory mandate breeds corporate risk aversion. That aversion drives localized, safe spending, which ultimately guarantees systemic geographic imbalance. Legislating philanthropy destroys the competitive market advantages that normally reward corporate good deeds, turning a differentiator into a fixed operational burden. The mandate acts as a rigid, unyielding mechanism that forces uniform corporate action, completely regardless of the surrounding environmental reality. Effective capital deployment requires strategic ecosystem support. It requires mature NGOs, clear laws, and risk-tolerant timelines to actually affect change. India's grand experiment proves you cannot simply mandate socioeconomic development. Without structural alignment, forced spending merely maps corporate financial capital directly onto existing geographic and industrial inequalities.